Hello, fellow night owls. Tonight we embark on a journey into the captivating yet challenging era of feudal Japan. Let's relax and immerse ourselves in the intricate world of warlords, samurai, and cherry blossoms, uncovering the factors that made this period a vibrant hub of culture and innovation, while also highlighting the oppressive feudal systems and constant warfare that subjected many ordinary people to harsh realities. Before we begin, take a moment to share your location and time in the comments. It's always fascinating to see how these stories resonate with people from different parts of the world. Now, let's settle in and allow our eyes to gradually grow heavier as we delve into feudal Japan through historical accounts and personal anecdotes. Let's begin. The story of the Tanaka family serves as a poignant illustration of the precarious position of many merchants during this time. Despite their gradual rise in economic influence, they remained at the bottom of the social hierarchy, burdened by heavy taxes and restrictions. In Edo, the Tanakas, a family of merchants, faced constant struggles to keep their small kimono shop afloat. Their days were filled with arduous tasks, hunched over bolts of fine silk, meticulously cutting and stitching elegant garments. Even the youngest children contributed to the family's efforts, assisting with the mixing of dyes and winding thread. While their exquisite wares adorned the wardrobes of noble ladies, the Tanakas themselves subsisted on meager meals of millet and pickled radish. Every spare coin was reinvested in their business, but the soaring silk prices and the heavy taxes imposed by the shogun eroded their slim profits. The Tanakas lived in constant fear of falling behind on payments and having their shops seized. Bribes to corrupt officials became an unavoidable expense. To make matters even more perilous, the family harbored a dangerous secret. They were closet Christians in a time when the foreign faith was strictly prohibited. If discovered, they faced the grim prospect of torture and execution as enemies of the state. But their beliefs provided solace in their challenging lives, and they cherished their concealed rosaries and whispered prayers. It's difficult to comprehend the extent of oppression imposed by feudal Japanese society on the lower classes. Poverty and arduous labor defined their existence, and a rigid code of conduct governed virtually every aspect of their behavior and appearance. Strict sumptuary laws meticulously outlined what each social rank could wear, eat, and own. Peasants and merchants were explicitly prohibited from wearing silk, vibrant colors, or elaborate hairstyles. The size and materials of their homes and furnishings were also strictly regulated. These trivial regulations ensured that the elite could never be mistaken for commoners. However, conformity and control extended beyond outward appearances. Frivolous entertainments like theater, music, and dancing were frowned upon as debased and immoral. Public displays of affection were considered shameful. Proper etiquette demanded constant observance, with numerous rituals for everything from serving tea to greeting superiors. A culture of restraint and puritanism permeated society, particularly among the samurai. Overt displays of emotion were deeply unseemly for the warrior class, who were expected to endure life's trials with stoic endurance. A slip into decorum could result in a loss of face and reputation. For women, the restrictions were even more oppressive. Demure obedience and selfless service were the highest virtues of a proper lady. An idealized beauty was one of a pale, slender figure draped in a voluminous kimono, with every hair and fold meticulously arranged. This was the stifling world of Hana, a young geisha in training. To the men she entertained, she embodied feminine subservience and graceful artistry. She could skillfully pour sake and engage in witty conversation with a carefully cultivated air of elegant mystery. However, beneath her composed exterior, Hana yearned for the freedom to break free from the austere code of conduct that dictated her every move. As a geisha, her appearance was meticulously regulated, from the tilt of her shima hairstyle to the shade of red on her lips. She once dared to wear a purple kimono reserved for higher-ranking geisha, resulting in severe punishment and confinement to her quarters for days. Another time, Hana allowed herself to reciprocate the flirtatious affections of a charming young client. However, when the tea-house mistress discovered this, she was harshly beaten as a stark reminder that geisha were never to be mistaken for common prostitutes. A geisha's allure lay in her untouchable beauty, not her availability. As the years passed, Hana grew increasingly disillusioned with the artificial world of the flower and willow realm. She was essentially an indentured servant, her body and talents owned by the okia that had invested in her training. There was no room for genuine love or free choices. She yearned for independence as an ordinary wife and mother, but knew the chances were slim. Instead, she numbed her hidden sorrows with stolen sips of sake when no one was looking. Even displaying a drinking problem would be a disgraceful breach of character. For commoners who ran afoul of the law, the consequences were infinitely harsher than a few snide remarks. The feudal justice system prioritized maintaining order and control over any semblance of impartiality. Laws were strict, guilt was assumed, and punishments were brutal and swift. Minor offenses routinely resulted in harsh corporal punishment. Pickpockets and vandals could expect public floggings, their skin flayed until they passed out from the pain. Thieves and adulterers often had their noses or ears locked off as a permanent mark of shame. Serious crimes met with horrific torture and execution. The techniques varied and were prolonged, including boiling, sawing, bludgeoning with heavy rods, and crucifixion, where the condemned were tied to a cross and repeatedly spied through with razor-sharp bamboo shoots. Perhaps most infamous was death by grilling, a method reserved for arsonists and murderers. The convict would be tied spread eagle, their bodies slowly roasted over several agonizing days as hot coals were piled on them. Their charred limbs might be hacked off one by one until merciful death arrived. Pity the hungry young peasant who dared to steal fish from the market. After a brief trial, he received 30 lashes with a wooden paddle, leaving him delirious and half dead. However, as a repeat offender, his fate was likely sealed. Petty theft carried a sentence of beheading under the Tokugawa regime. Indeed, the threat of gruesome punishment loomed over all those without rank or connections. Judicial torture was regularly used to extract confessions, regardless of guilt. Tokugawa law explicitly stated that it was better to convict an innocent man than let a guilty one go free. With virtually no rights or due process, commoners were helpless if charged with a crime at the whim of daimyos and magistrates. False accusations were commonly leveled to remove political rivals or seize property and assets. Justice was utterly arbitrary for those without power. Thus, the spectre of the law was just one more weight bearing down on the backs of the people. Their lives were defined by endless toil and deprivation, with only the slimmest hope of rising above their assigned station. For the peasants who made up the vast majority, poverty ground them down to the literal dirt. Punishing taxes and rice levies left little to fill their bellies. They subsisted on millet gruel and radish tops, while their lords feasted on white rice and venison. Crushing debts piled up season after season. Many became essentially slaves, bonded to their land and landlord. If their rice harvest fell short, their children might be sold into servitude to pay the difference. A bad crop could spell disaster for an entire village. When famine struck, peasants ate grass and bark to survive. Bands of gaunt, desperate vagrants roamed the roads, abandoned children wailed in empty huts, and corpses piled in ditches. Relief was limited to poultry and selective. When disease ravaged the land, the poor perished in droves. Smallpox and dysentery, exacerbated by malnutrition, left them with little hope. They could only pray to Jizo and Kannon, the merciful bodhisattvas, for salvation in the next life. Opportunities for a better life were scarce. The rigid class boundaries were nearly insurmountable, requiring privilege to transcend them. Education was limited to basic ciphering and calligraphy learned at temple schools, if that. For most, the only path was the arduous one their fathers and grandfathers had walked. It's no wonder, then, that some peasants reached their breaking point. After a series of poor harvests, a village might rise up in raw desperation, even knowing the futility of their actions. Such was the case in 1781, when starving farmers in the Tohoku region attacked tax collectors and stormed their daimyo's castle, demanding relief from rice levies. Hundreds more joined them, seizing weapons and torching government storehouses. However, like every peasant rebellion, this one was doomed. The uprising crumbled in the face of trained samurai. The farmers fled to the mountains, and the daimyo ordered all the village men beheaded as an example. Their wives and daughters were sold into prostitution. And so the peasants submitted again, backs bent under the knowledge that they could rage against their fate, but never escape it. They prayed for the distant promise of a world turned upside down where the virtuous poor would become lords in the Buddha's paradise. The feudal order endured for another century, but the weight of its oppression grew heavier. Merchants and artisans grew restless, their wealth buying them fine things but not respect. Samurai found their way of life threatened, their rituals of blood and honor losing their meaning. Cracks spidered through the foundation, the fury and desperation of millions upon whose stooped backs the elite few perched in splendor. When foreign powers shook Japan's gates, the Tokugawa's grand edifice crumbled into dust and ruin. Reflecting on feudal Japanese life, it's hard to comprehend the immense suffering endured by most, except the privileged. Conformity and control permeated every aspect of life, from clothing to housing, every tug and bite. War, famine, and punishment loomed large, casting a constant shadow. The rigid hierarchy, determined by birth, dictated one's fate, leaving little room for questioning. Modernity introduced its own horrors and inequities, but the past offers solace in the possibility of great change. Even entrenched systems of oppression can crumble, and we can envision a society of justice and dignity for all. The feudal peasant, toiling to the end of his days in a world of blades and hunger, would scarcely believe it. So, if you enjoyed this journey through history's darker corners, consider liking and subscribing for more. There are countless shadowed chapters yet to explore, the blood-soaked ground upon which our present is built. But for now, let this lull you into sleep, and may all your waking dreams be kinder than the long nightmares of the past. The harsh justice system of feudal Japan mirrored the rigid social hierarchy and the paramount importance placed on maintaining order and control. In a society where birth determined one's station and social mobility was limited, laws were designed to enforce conformity. Minor crimes, such as petty theft, gambling, and disorderly conduct, were severely punished, often resulting in public floggings. The accused were left bloodied and battered as a warning to others. More serious offenses, like repeated larceny or forgery, could lead to the loss of a hand or even beheading. Trials were swift and largely a formality. With little presumption of innocence, suspects were often subjected to torture to extract confessions. The belief was that an innocent person would never admit to a crime they didn't commit, even under duress. Samurai had the privilege of being tried by their peers in a warrior court, but commoners had no such rights. Punishments were publicly inflicted to maximize their deterrent effect. Crucifixion was the most brutal fate, reserved for treason and other grave crimes against the state. The condemned would be lashed to a wooden cross and pierced with spears, enduring an agonizing and drawn-out death. Their bodies would be left on display for days as a grim reminder of the consequences of defiance. One small mercy was the practice of death by proxy, where a family member could request to be executed in place of their loved one. This spared the condemned from suffering and allowed them an honorable end. However, it was a tragic choice that only the most loyal would make. Consider the tale of Hikaru, a young artisan's apprentice in the city of Asaka. His master was a skilled but ill-tempered swordsmith who was prone to heavy drinking and fits of rage. One evening, when his master was harshly berating him over a minor infraction, Hikaru snapped and struck him with a tool, fracturing his skull. Hikaru was swiftly arrested and thrown into a damp prison cell to await trial. He was denied food and water, kept in darkness, and subjected to merciless interrogation by his captors. Exhausted and disoriented, he eventually confessed to the attack under the threat of torture. At his trial, Hikaru's guilt was presumed from the outset. His tearful pleas that it was an accident and his appeals to his master's good character fell on deaf ears. With the swordsmith hovering near death, the judge wasted no time in reaching a verdict. Hikaru would face crucifixion for his crime. On the day of his execution, Hikaru was pale and trembling as he was paraded through the streets and lashed to the cross. As the executioners prepared to pierce him with spears, Hikaru's elderly father stepped forward and prostrated himself before the magistrate. With his face pressed to the ground, he implored the magistrate to take his place on the cross, claiming that his own life was nearing its end, while Hikaru's was just beginning. Overcome with sorrow, the magistrate reluctantly agreed to the substitution, acknowledging the father's noble sacrifice. Hikaru wailed as he watched his father, the man who had always protected him, be subjected to a torturous death in his stead. The guilt was more excruciating than the spears would have been. Despite living a long life as a master swordsmith, Hikaru was forever haunted by the cost of that second chance. Stories like Hikaru were all too common in feudal Japan, where a single misstep could doom an entire family. The cruel and unyielding justice system was just one more tool used by the powerful to exert control over the masses. It served as a constant reminder that in this society, people were ultimately expendable cogs in the larger machine. For the peasants and artisans who constituted the majority of the population, life was an endless cycle of toil and hardship with little hope of escape. They were born into poverty and were likely to die in it, never experiencing a life beyond backbreaking labor in the fields or hunched over a workbench. The fortunate ones might enjoy a modest existence with enough to eat and a roof over their heads, but they walked a razor's edge, always one failed harvest or broken contract away from destitution. A single stroke of misfortune could plunge a family into starvation and ruin. Consider the Ito family, humble rice farmers in a small village near Kyoto. For generations, they had tended the same small plot of land, barely scraping out a living. They lived simply in a tiny thatched hut, subsisting on a diet of mostly rice and vegetables, with the occasional fish or scrap of meat. The father, Toshi, was a stooped-shouldered man who had known nothing but toil since he could walk. Each day, before dawn, he rose to tend to the rice paddies. He planted, weeded, and watered them until his hands were rough and muddied. His wife, May, worked alongside him while also caring for their 3 small children and aging parents. Despite their best efforts, the Ito family lived in constant precariousness. Over half of their rice harvest went to paying rents and taxes to their local lord. What remained was barely enough to feed their family and trade for other necessities. They were one flood or drought away from disaster. That ill fortune struck in the summer of 1783 when a powerful typhoon tore through their region, flattening fields and destroying storehouses. Ito's entire rice crop was wiped out, along with their seed stock for the next planting. They suddenly faced the very real prospect of starvation. With heavy hearts, Toshi and May made the difficult decision to sell their young daughter, Akari, into indentured servitude with a wealthy merchant family. It was the only way to keep the rest of the family fed. They told themselves it was temporary, that they would work hard and save every spare coin to one day buy back her freedom. But deep down, they knew it might be the last they ever saw of their bright-eyed girl. Akari's story was tragically common in feudal Japan, where crushing poverty trapped families for generations. Children were often commodities to be sold or traded during times of hardship. Many rural girls ended up trafficked to city brothels and tea houses, forever losing their innocence to keep their families afloat for a little longer. This was the relentless reality for the peasantry, a never-ending struggle for survival that stripped away dignity and hope. They were the human fuel that kept the feudal machine lurching forward, their suffering greasing the gears for the benefit of the ruling class far above. And so, life ground on for the masses, a timeless cycle of hard labor, deprivation, and quiet despair. Their fates were dictated by the accident of birth. It would take a fundamental reordering of society for there to be any dreams beyond the unforgiving fields and the never-ending demands of the tax collector. However, such change would be a long time coming. In the 15th century, a new philosophy began to take root among the ruling elite, further solidifying the rigid social hierarchy. Neo-Confucianism, as it was known, preached that social harmony depended on everyone knowing their rightful place and dutifully fulfilling their role, regardless of their position. At the pinnacle of this divine hierarchy was the emperor, who reigned but did not exercise direct control. He was regarded as a godlike figure, a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, yet held little practical power. This power was wielded by the shogun, the supreme military leader who ruled in the emperor's name. Below the shogun were the daimyo, feudal lords who controlled vast estates and armies of samurai. Although subordinate to the shogun, the daimyo enjoyed significant autonomy in their domains, essentially functioning as kings. They were expected to maintain peace, collect taxes, and provide military service when called upon. At the bottom of this hierarchical structure were the peasants, artisans, and merchants, the vast majority of the population. Neo-Confucian thought held that they were inherently inferior to the samurai class above them, and that their only path to virtue was through obedience and service. Nowhere were these oppressive ideas more enthusiastically embraced than in Edo, the seat of the shogunate. There, conformity was the highest ideal, and any deviation from societal norms was perceived as a threat to the natural order. The Tokugawa shoguns, who ruled Japan for over 250 years, were ardent proponents of Neo-Confucianism. They used it to justify their authoritarian rule and the stringent sumptu laws that dictated every aspect of daily life. Commoners were informed about their clothing, food, and even the type of houses they could live in based on their social standing. Peasants were prohibited from wearing silk and were compelled to craft their garments from coarse hemp or cotton. Despite their growing wealth from trade, merchants were forbidden from flaunting their success. Even the well-bred geisha were bound by numerous rules governing their appearance and behavior. The political machinations and intrigue prevalent in Kyoto and Osaka were subdued in Edo, where an unwavering adherence to decorum prevailed. Samurai strutted through the streets, confident in their privileged status, while commoners bowed and scraped. Public criticism of the government was strictly prohibited, and informers eagerly reported even the slightest signs of rebellion. In this austere atmosphere where etiquette and ritual held paramount importance, we find Haru, a young woman born into the merchant class. Her family operated a modest yet thriving shop that sold exquisite paper used for calligraphy and official documents, providing them with a precarious connection to elite society. From a young age, Haru resented the limitations imposed upon her as a woman and a commoner. She possessed a sharp intellect and harbored secret aspirations of becoming a scholar, devouring classical texts in her father's storeroom. However, such intellectual pursuits were deemed inappropriate for a merchant's daughter, who was expected to master the tea ceremony and flower arranging to secure a suitable husband. Haru's parents were loving yet firm, instilling in her the significance of upholding the family's honor and recognizing her rightful place. They had made significant sacrifices to provide her with a refined upbringing and could not tolerate any rebelliousness that might jeopardize their hard-earned respectability. Consequently, Haru learned to conceal her true nature behind a facade of quiet obedience. She served tea and recited poetry with a composed smile. All the while, she yearned for a different life, secretly hiding her cherished books under her futon and reading them by candlelight, exhilarated by the forbidden knowledge. Her clandestine studies abruptly came to an end when her mother discovered her stash of subversive texts. They were works by a renegade philosopher who dared to challenge the prevailing doctrine of blind obedience to authority. Haru's mother was horrified, fearing the consequences if such dangerous ideas were discovered in their home. Haru pleaded that the books were not hers, that she was merely borrowing them for a friend. However, her mother saw through her lies. As punishment, Haru was confined to her room for a month, allowed to leave only to assist in the shop under close supervision. Her books were burned in the courtyard, their ashes scattered to the wind. From that day forward, Haru was forced into meek compliance. Resigned to the restricted path laid before her, she married the son of a fellow merchant, a kind but dull man who shared none of her intellectual curiosity. She bore 3 children and devoted herself to being a model wife and mother, burying her unorthodox dreams deep within. To the outside world, Haru was the epitome of a proper Edo woman, graceful and ever obliging. Only in the deepest reaches of the night, lying beside her slumbering husband, did she allow her mind to wander to what might have been. If only she had been born in a different time, a different place, a different body. Haru's story was not uncommon in the oppressive atmosphere of Edo society. Conformity was the mantra, and the individual who deviated was swiftly crushed. With their individuality suppressed and their minds constrained, many simply submitted to the well-trodden paths of tradition and duty. However, in remote corners of the archipelago, far from the watchful eyes of the authorities, pockets of resistance simmered. On the battered islands of the far south, a peculiar foreign faith was taking root, promising spiritual liberation from the rigid structures of feudal life. Catholic missionaries, initially welcomed by the shogunate as purveyors of new knowledge and trade, had been violently expelled in the early 1600s. Christianity was banned as a subversive influence. Its adherents compelled them to renounce their beliefs or face torture and execution. Many went underground, forming secret communities bound by faith and necessity. Among them were the hidden Christians of the Shimabara Peninsula, a rugged land of craggy inlets and lush green valleys. For over 2 centuries, they outwardly practiced Buddhism, while diligently passing down the rites and rituals of the church. Baptisms were performed in secluded forest glens, and masses were held in secret after midnight. The villages of Shimabara eked out a meager living as farmers and fishermen, struggling to survive in the stingy soil. They found solace in their clandestine faith, which preached the equality of all before an all-loving God. It served as a powerful antidote to the oppressive Neo-Confucian orthodoxy that dominated their daily lives. Ichiro was born into this world of fertile devotion and constant fear. From a young age, he was taught the significance of keeping the family's true beliefs hidden from outsiders. He learned to recite the Heart Sutra by heart, even as he fervently whispered the Lord's Prayer when no one was listening. As Ichiro grew into manhood, he shouldered increasing responsibilities in his small community. He led prayer meetings in hushed seaside caves and officiated weddings with crude-fashioned crosses. To the outside world, he portrayed himself as an earthy fisherman with a hearty laugh and a wealth of coarse stories. However, Ichiro remained ever vigilant, aware that a single slip could bring the authorities crashing down on him and everything he held dear. He lived with the constant dread of discovery and the fear of failing in his sacred duty to carry the flame of his ancestors' faith. That dreaded day arrived in the autumn of his 27th year, when a nosy tax collector from the regional capital arrived in the village. Repulsed by the poverty and the crude dialect of the locals, the official was eager to find fault and extract more wealth from the downtrodden peasants. As the tax collector surveyed the village headman's dilapidated home, he noticed something unusual on the dirt-streaked wall. It was a crude outline of a cross etched in charcoal, partially concealed behind tattered scrolls of Buddhist mantras. With a triumphant shout, the officials seized upon this damning evidence of the forbidden faith. When the headman fell to his knees, babbling desperate denials, the cruel bureaucrats sneered, certain he had uncovered a nest of dangerous heretics. Ichiro watched in dread from the shadows as the tax collector summoned a squad of armed samurai to round up the terrified villagers. He knew he should flee into the mountains and live to fight another day. However, he couldn't abandon his flock to face the impending storm alone. With a heavy heart, Ichiro stepped forward into the torchlight. In a calm and clear voice, he declared himself a follower of Christ and the leader of the hidden church. He commanded the trembling headman to remain silent to protect the others through his mute compliance. Over the shouts of the samurai, Ichiro began to sing a hymn of joyful surrender. As the warriors fell upon him with their clubs, Ichiro rejoiced in the knowledge that his sacrifice would buy precious time for his fellow believers to scatter and regroup. He would gladly endure the coming torments, content in the promise of a glorious reward in the world to come. Ichiro's story served as a testament to the quiet and steadfast resistance that persisted in the forgotten corners of feudal Japan. Despite the shogunate's ruthless suppression, it couldn't completely extinguish the spark of spirit that yearned for something beyond the stifling confines of the feudal order. However, such defiance came at a terrible cost. The hidden Christians of Shimabara were brutally eradicated and executed en masse, their villages destroyed and their names blackened in official histories. It would be many generations before their descendants could practice their faith openly, free from the suffocating grip of persecution. Surveying the panorama of feudal Japan, one can only be astounded by the resilience of those who endured such relentless hardship and injustice. From the calloused peasants toiling in the muddy rice fields to the hunched artisans laboring in the smoky cities, life was an unending trial of back-breaking labor and deprivation. The ruling samurai class, despite their lofty pretensions of honor and bushido, were little more than glorified thugs, lording their military might over the cowering masses. Obsessed with rank and protocol, they were quick to take offense and met out harsh discipline for the slightest breach of their precious codes. Women, already subservient cattle, faced especially dismal prospects, denied education and agency. They were valued only for their utility as submissive wives and fertile wombs. The heroic few who dared to rebel against their prescribed roles faced crushing ostracization and violence. This was the lot of the common people of feudal Japan, born into suffocating obligation to live in constant scarcity. As we've seen, life for the vast majority during the long centuries of feudal Japan was defined by endless toil, deprivation, and a rigid social order that kept people firmly in their place from birth until death, finally released them from their suffering. One of the most striking examples of this entrenched inequality and oppression was the plight of the barakumen, Japan's untouchable underclass. These were people born into hereditary occupations considered unclean by Buddhist and Shinto tradition, primarily involving death or the handling of animal flesh, such as undertaking butchery, tanning hides, and leatherwork. Imagine being born into this reviled caste through no choice of your own. Your family trapped for generations in a self-perpetuating cycle of discrimination and squalor. Forced to live in a segregated hamlet on the outskirts of town, you're a crowded slum of ramshackle huts, lacking even the meanest comforts. Forbidden from marrying outside your class, your spouse must hail from the same wretched background, ensuring your children inherit the same fate. Grinding poverty is almost inevitable when the only occupations available to you are dirty, dangerous, and low-paying. You labor tirelessly from sunrise to sunset, collapsing exhausted each night in your bare hovel. When venturing into town for errands, you must wear distinguishing clothing that marks you as untouchable, such as a straw hat or a dirty, ragged kimono. In the streets, people recoil from you or hurl vicious insults. Shopkeepers charge inflated prices or refuse to serve your kind altogether. Dehumanizing discrimination follows you at every turn. Your children, too, face constant ostracism and bullying. Other families forbid their sons and daughters from associating with yours. No matter how bright and capable they may be, your offspring are barred from all but the lowest occupations. They're turned away from schools, apprenticeships, and temples, condemned to the same wretched existence you've known since birth. This is the excruciating reality Saburo Yoshio was born into in a Barakumen ghetto on the edge of Kyoto in the late 1700s. As a young boy, Saburo resented the demeaning restrictions and yearned to venture into the wider city. However, when the other children noticed his distinctive straw sandals and filthy rags, they mercilessly taunted him, pelting him with pebbles until he fled back to the muddy alleys of the outcast's slum. Saburo's father, like his father before him, struggled to make a meager living as a leather worker. He collected cowhides from local slaughterhouses and tanned them for months in large, stinking vats of caustic vegetable tannins before shaping the rough leather into sandals, saddles, and scabbards. It was a filthy, noxious job, but it was the only trade open to an untouchable man. From the age of 7, Saburo was thrust into his father's esteemed tanning yard. The astringent stench of cow urine and caustic lime permanently saturated his skin and hair. His hands became pocked with putrid sores from the hides soaked in their toxic baths. After a long day up to his shins in the tanning pits, he would come home, his lungs seared from the fumes. As Saburo entered manhood, he dreamed of marrying a pretty girl from town and escaping his miserable life. In the spring, he began sneaking into Kyoto on market days, hoping to catch the eye of a lovely maiden. However, he quickly learned that even a friendly smile in his direction was out of the question. The city girls turned up their noses at his stench and scurried away in revulsion, sometimes spitting in his direction to ward off his pollution. Desperate, Saburo finally wed the daughter of the local gravedigger in a peruncta ceremony, resigning himself to perpetuating another generation of ostracized outcasts. Together they raised 3 children in the same hovel he had grown up in, barely managing to keep them fed by their combined toil at society's foulest tasks. Despite his pride, Saburo was forced to hide his face behind a woven reed hat in town, lest he provoke a torrent of abuse. Once, when he dared look a samurai in the eye, the warrior smashed him in the face with an iron-studded jita, knocking out his front teeth. Saburo had no legal recourse as the feudal authorities cared little for how society's dregs were bullied and brutalized. In this way, Saburo and his family lived out their days in squalid ignominy, toiling at repulsive work from dawn to dusk, forever shunned by their fellow man. They were trapped at the very bottom of the social order, their choices and chances extinguished from birth. For generation after generation, the Barakumen molded in their ghettos feudal Japan's permanent untouchable underclass. Of course, life was scarcely less constricted for the peasantry at large. Farm folk, despite being spared the extreme stigma of the barracuman, found themselves trapped in a bleak station fixed at birth. They were bound to the land of their local lord, enjoying precious few freedoms beyond the grueling labor that consumed their waking hours. Imagine an existence of ceaseless, back-breaking toil from your earliest childhood days onward. Each morning you wake on a reed mat, your belly half empty, and stumble out into the muddy fields to guide an ox-drawn plough or plant endless rows of rice seedlings bent double at the waist. Icy water soaks your legs to the bone as you slosh through the patties, your feet cut and arranged. At the height of the growing season, you labor in the fields for 12, 14, or even 16 hours a day, pausing only for a few meager meals of millet gruel and pickled radish if you're lucky. Your face and neck are burnt nut brown by the relentless sun, and your hands are gnulled and calloused from gripping tools. A straw hat provides scant relief from the heat as you sweat and strain until every muscle aches. Of course, this assumes favorable weather and a bountiful harvest. But when the rains fail or the crops are destroyed by pests, your family teeters on the brink of starvation. When the rice crop finally arrives, much of it is destined for your daimyo's storehouses, owed as tax for farming his land. You watch stoically as the best of your back-breaking efforts are carted away by sneering samurai tax collectors. Should you fail to meet your assigned quota, you'll be severely beaten as a malingor and fined into destitution. Come winter, you shiver in your flea-ridden thatch hut, a single charcoal brazier providing scant warmth as icy winds knife through the walls. You wrap yourself in a tattered, lice-ridden kimono and dream of spring's distant arrival, but you know full well that it heralds only a return to the ceaseless bone-wrenching drudgery that has defined every moment of your wretched life. Such was the fate of Kenji Nakamura, born into a poor farming village in the shadow of his daimyo's towering castle near Hime in the early 1600s. From the tender age of 5, Kenji was in the rice fields beside his father, diligently contributing to their family's survival. His childhood was an endless blur of blistered hands, aching muscles, and growling hunger. At the tender age of 13, Kenji witnessed helplessly as his mother succumbed to fever after a meager harvest. Her once robust body had been reduced to little more than a skeleton wrapped in paper-thin skin. He helped dig her grave in the rocky soil behind their hut, tears streaming down his face as his father silently uttered a simple prayer to Amida Buddha for her salvation in the Western paradise. With his mother gone, Kenji took on even more arduous work, rising before dawn to pound millet for grill, then enduring the frigid patties until dusk. His youth was a relentless cycle of planting, weeding, frightening away birds, and finally harvesting the precious rice that the village depended utterly on for survival. In a good year, they would have enough to fill their bellies until spring, after the tax grain was rendered up. In a bad year, they would huddle in their huts as the snow fell, subsisting on a thin grill of boiled bark and bran, praying fervently that they would not follow their weakest members to the grave before the planting season renewed them. As a young man, Kenji fulfilled his societal expectations and married a plain farmer's daughter from the neighboring village. He took her into his family's hut to bear the next generation of downtrodden tillers bound to their lord's land. She labored stoically beside him in the fields and rice paddies, even when heavily pregnant, pausing only to squat in the mud and deliver the next infant. Over the years, Kenji watched 4 of his children succumb to the usual ailments of the peasantry. 2 of Kenji's sons and a daughter survived to adulthood, taking their place beside him in the never-ending labor of their allotted plot. They would marry, bear children of their own, and eventually open a spot in the earth for his weary bones. The cycle of toil, hardship, and acceptance would continue unbroken, as it had for generations beyond memory. Looking back over his life from the vantage point of stooped and aching old age, Kenji sometimes wondered if some other existence was possible. He thought of the village headman in his fine silk kimono, the samurai with their polished swords and lacquered armor, and the fat merchants who sold his mill rice in the distant city. These were lives he could scarcely imagine. In the end, Kenji accepted that he had lived as his father had lived, and his father before him. He had endured providing for his family as best he could against the deprivations of an indifferent world. There was a certain hard-won dignity in that. So, from cradle to grave, the peasantry of feudal Japan lived out their humble, circumscribed lives. They were born to their ceaseless labor, married to perpetuate it, and died never knowing anything else. Bent over in the paddies, crouched by smoky hearths, they watched the seasons change and the years roll by, toiling under the watchful gaze of castle keeps and temple spires erected on the fruits of their efforts. They shouldered the burden of their thankless station, scarcely daring to dream of a life less mean. But every so often a bolder soul would arise, questioning his ordained place and galvanized to action. As the Edo period neared its chaotic end, voices of dissent grew louder, challenging the ancient feudal order. One such man was Hideki Ito, a peasant from a rugged village in Honshu's mountains. Like his fellow farmers, Hideki endured backbreaking labor, hunger, and arbitrary exploitation by the samurai class since childhood. However, deep within him simmered righteous anger at the injustice of his situation. When a cruel new daimyo took control of his domain in the 1860s, Hideki could no longer bear it. The daimyo, eager to maximize productivity, imposed crippling taxes and ordered his samurai to punish farmers who fell short of quotas. That year, an early frost devastated the harvest, and Hideki turned a blind eye to his people's suffering and starvation, refusing to use his reserves of rice. Fueled by barely suppressed rage, Hideki began meeting with like-minded men from neighboring villages. In the dead of night, they gathered in the woods to vent their anger and contemplate rebellion. Initially, Hideki was terrified by the prospect of peasant uprisings being ruthlessly suppressed. However, as he witnessed his fellow villagers' gaunt and hollow faces and his own young daughters wilting away, his fear gave way to fury. That spring, Hideki and his band launched their attack. In a meticulously coordinated strike, they ambushed the daimyo's tax collectors during their rounds, beating them senseless and seizing their ill-gotten gains. They raided government storehouses, distributing rice and tools to the jubilant local farmers. Overwhelmed with success, Hideki led his growing mob toward the daimyo's castle, torches blazing, but he had severely underestimated the speed and brutality of the ruling class's response. Upon learning of the uprising, the daimyo dispatched his most ruthless samurai on horseback. Armed to the teeth, they descended upon the rebel mob, trampling men beneath the hooves of their steeds and cutting down others in a whirlwind of flashing swords. The farmers scattered in terror, their farming tools no match for the samurai's blades. Amidst the chaos, Hideki spotted the samurai commander, a sneering man astride a black charger. Half mad with righteous fury, Hideki lunged at him, swinging his crude stake with all his might. But the samurai contemptuously knocked it away with his sword and cleaved Hideki's skull in two with an effortless riposte. Hideki crumpled to the ground, drowning in a crimson torrent, his light fading from his eyes as swiftly as his dreams of a more just world. In the aftermath, the daimyo made a terrible example of the rebel farmers. Dozens were beheaded, their leaders brutally crucified. The village was burned to the ground, leaving its women and children to starve in the ashes. The message was clear. Such defiance would be met with the most pitiless retribution. The social order would be preserved at any cost, in blood and suffering. But unbeknownst to the callous ruling elite, the seeds of its eventual destruction had already been sown. The injustices and contradictions of the feudal system were becoming impossible to ignore, even as foreign powers were knocking at Japan's long-sealed doors. The time of the samurai was drawing to a close, the fury of the downtrodden peasantry no longer so easily contained. The Japanese people would endure yet more chaos, bloodshed, and upheaval before emerging into the light of the modern era. But they would emerge, shaking off the stagnation of centuries and embracing the revolutionary ideals of progress, openness, and equality. In a few heady decades, the shoguns, daimyos, and samurai would fade into legend, swept away by the tide of history. But the long, nightmarish centuries in which they had held sway would not soon be forgotten. The spectre of those dark times lingered, a stark reminder of a feudal past characterized by cruelty, oppression, and entrenched inequality. In that era, the mere accident of birth determined one's fate, and the strong reveled in their dominion over the weak. The fruits of the many were devoured by an armored view. As the fading evening light bathed the landscape, an old farmer straightened up from his work, surveying the emerald patchwork of rice paddies stretching to the horizon. He was acutely aware of the endless toil that defined his life, its toll resonating deep within his bones. Yet he also recognized that this was a different age. His children and grandchildren would have opportunities unimaginable to his ancestors. They would attend school, learn to read, and perhaps even venture to the bustling city to forge a new life. He had heard whispers of rights, elections, and a constitution designed to safeguard the common man. These were still nascent and fragile notions, yet they stirred something profound within him. He dared to envision a future where his kind were no longer mere chat, mere playthings of the powerful, but citizens of equal dignity, valued beyond the mere labor of their callous hands. Of course, much hard work lay ahead, with numerous obstacles yet to be overcome. He understood that his grandsons might well find themselves stooped over in these same patties, weighed down by the weary rhythms of the old cycle. Change would not come swiftly to this timeless landscape of lush fields, swaying pines and ancient hills. But as the last rays of sun dipped below the peaks, the old man allowed himself a moment of cautious hope. He straightened his creaking back and inhaled deeply of the cooling air. His people had endured so much for so long, adapting to every twist and turn of fate. Surely, slowly but inexorably, they would find their way to that brighter future, look back on the long darkness, and marvel at how far they had come. However, such grand transformations would unfold in their own good time. For now, the old farmer turned for home, ready to ease his aching frame into bed and welcome the oblivion of sleep. Tomorrow, he will rise and take his first step. Amidst these tales of hardship and brutality, a stark picture emerges of a society where the mere accident of one's birth dictated the course of their life. The class one was born into was the class one would die in, with precious little chance of ascending above their station, regardless of their capabilities or industriousness. For the vast peasantry, life was an unrelenting struggle against hunger, toil, and the constant threat of violence from their samurai overlords. Most barely managed to survive, subsisting on millet, barley, and a few precious scraps of vegetables. Meat was a rare luxury. In lean years, which were all too common, many resorted to eating grass and roots to fill their bellies as famine ravaged the land. The peasants worked tirelessly from sunrise to sunset in the rice paddies and fields, their backs permanently bent from the ceaseless labor. They lived in constant fear of displeasing their lords, knowing that any perceived insolence could result in a swift and brutal beating from the samurai and their forces. It was a life devoid of creature comforts and filled with hardships, with little to look forward to but more of the same. Even for the artisans and merchants who enjoyed a slightly higher social standing, life was far from easy. While some merchants achieved wealth through trade, they still languished at the bottom of the social hierarchy, despised by the samurai elite. Sumptuary laws restricted their ability to flaunt their success, dictating the size of their houses and the fabrics they could wear. Stepping outside the boundaries of one's rank was strictly discouraged. The craftsmen and artisans, while skilled in their trades, also had limited autonomy. They labored under the rigid control of guilds that restricted their production and pricing. Original designs were stifled in favor of time-tested traditional motifs. An independent spirit could lead to censure and sanctions from the guild masters. Perhaps the most disadvantaged were the outcasts of society, the ETA and Hainan underclasses. These individuals were compelled into degrading occupations and forced to reside in segregated settlements on the outskirts of towns and cities. They were regarded as subhuman and tainted by their association with death and waste. Treated as untouchables, they faced abuse and even death without consequence. Advancement for those outside the samurai class was virtually impossible. Society functioned as a ladder with most rungs missing, blocked by the Neo-Confucian doctrine that upheld rigid hierarchies as the natural order. One's fate was predetermined at birth. Obedience and humility were expected in fulfilling one's duties, and death was met with a mere mark on the world. Even within the ruling samurai class, life was far from ideal. The romanticized image of the warrior as a life of honor and glory masked the harsh reality of a short, brutal, and bleak existence. If fortunate, one could serve their daimyo faithfully and die of old age. However, the specter of violent death loomed large. Any misstep or defeat could necessitate the gruesome self-sacrifice of seppuku to absolve one's shame. Consequently, most samurai prepared for this possibility by composing death poems to be recited upon their bloody demise. The renowned samurai warrior Toyotomi Hideyoshi epitomized the ruthless spirit of the era. Born as a lowly peasant through sheer talent and unscrupulous maneuvering, he ascended to become Japan's most formidable ruler, assuming the role of regent in the late 1500s. His reign was marked by brutal policies, including the persecution of Christians and a series of invasions of Korea that resulted in millions of deaths. Hideyoshi's megalomania knew no bounds. In a notorious incident, he ordered the ears of 30,000 slain Korean soldiers to be pickled in brine and entombed in a gruesome mound as a war trophy. Despite his reputation as a great hero of unification, Hideyoshi harbored a vast and cruel streak that reflected the harsh realities of the time. For all classes and social strata within feudal Japanese society, life was often harsh, brutish, and short. War, famine, poverty, and oppression were inescapable realities of existence. For most, the code of Bushido and the refinements of art and culture coexisted uneasily with a system that imposed stark brutality on the populace. Even the highest lords lived under the constant threat of shifting alliances, coups, and violent overthrow. Any perceived weakness could prove fatal in the cutthroat world of feudal politics. The price of power was eternal vigilance against usurpers and rivals. This state of affairs persisted for centuries until the feudal system finally began to crumble in the 1800s due to economic change, Western influence, and rising discontent among the lower classes. The shogun's hold on power weakened, and a new era dawned with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. However, for the generations that lived and died under the weight of feudal oppression, life was often a test of endurance in the face of immense adversity. The human spirit persevered, finding moments of joy amidst the hardships, but daily existence was far removed from the romanticized image of the noble samurai and his loyal retainers. The reality was harsher, crueler, and more stratified. It was a time of short lives and long sufferings for many. The feudal centuries cast a long shadow over Japanese history, serving as a reminder of the darkness that can coexist with the light in the human story. As we conclude this chapter on the often brutal realities of life in feudal Japan, let us reflect on the resilience of those who endured such times. Their world was almost unimaginable compared to our own, yet they too experienced love, hope, fear, and sorrow. In our modern comfort and security, it is easy to forget the trials of those who came before us. However, by remembering their harsh circumstances, we may better appreciate the freedoms and opportunities we enjoy today. History, even at its darkest, offers valuable lessons about the progress of the human condition. The feudal era of Japan, despite its cruelties and inequities, sowed the seeds of what would eventually grow into a strong and dynamic nation. The values of discipline, loyalty, aesthetics, and community that were forged during that era would shape and define Japanese culture for generations to come. Although a long road still lay ahead, the first steps had been taken. As the sun sets low over the feudal horizon, we bid farewell to this bygone age. May your dreams be gentler than the times we've discussed, and your days brighter than those of the past. If you found this historical tour engaging, your loyal guide would be honored by a like and a subscribe. There are always more stories to tell, but for now, rest well, secure in the knowledge that the present, despite its challenges, remains a kinder time than the harsh centuries we've left behind. The past recedes, but its lessons endure. As the nobles of old retired to their castle keeps, we return to the keep of sleep. A little wiser, a little weary and grateful for our place in a world that has moved on from such feudal days. Good night. As the sun set over the rugged hills, casting long shadows across the village below, the peasants returned from another grueling day in the fields. Their faces were weathered and worn, etched with the hardships of their meager existence. They moved slowly, their bodies hunched from years of back-breaking labor, their feet shuffling up the dirt paths to their humble homes. In one small hut, a flickering oil lamp illuminated the drawn face of a young mother as she stirred a pot of thin rice gruel over the cooking fire. Her infant son whimpered in a basket nearby, his belly distended from hunger. The woman's husband sat slumped against the wall, staring vacantly into the dancing flames, his calloused hands lying idle in his lap. The day's work had left him spent in both body and spirit. This was the nightly scene in countless peasant households across feudal Japan. Life was an unrelenting struggle for survival, with little respite or hope for a better future. From dawn till dusk, peasants toiled in their lord's fields, struggling to survive on the unforgiving earth. They were the lowest rung on the social ladder, the foundation of the feudal system. Yet they reaped few of its rewards. During the feudal era, up to 90% of the population were peasants, bound to the land in a state of virtual servitude. Although not technically slaves, they were not free to leave their villages or change their lives. Born into their position, they died in it. Their days were an endless cycle of sowing, reaping, and laboring in service to their daimyo lords. The daimyo were wealthy landowners who ruled over their peasants like petty kings. From lavish castles overlooking vast domains, they wielded absolute authority over their subjects' lives. Peasants worked the daimyo's land, paid him taxes in rice and other goods, and even fought in his armies when called upon. In return, they received the dubious privilege of barely surviving on whatever scraps were left over. It was a precarious existence, forever at the mercy of forces beyond their control. A late frost, a summer drought, or a plague of locusts could spell disaster, destroying crops and plunging villages into famine. With no surpluses or safety nets, a bad harvest could mean starvation and death for the weakest and most vulnerable. Even in good times, peasant families teetered on the brink of destitution. Most barely grew enough food to fill their bellies, let alone pay the daimyo's taxes and still have something left to sell or trade. They subsisted on a monotonous diet of rice, vegetables, and the occasional bit of fish, if they were fortunate enough to live near the coast. Meat was a rare luxury, as were the colorful silk kimono worn by their samurai overlords. Rough homespun cotton was the fabric of the peasant class. Their humble homes, small and dark huts of wood and mud with thatched roofs, often housed both humans and animals. A typical peasant family lived, ate, and slept together in a single smoky room, with only a few worn futons on the dirt floor for furniture. Privacy was non-existent, and sanitation was primitive at best, creating a breeding ground for disease, especially in crowded villages where sewage flowed in open gutters. Fire posed an ever-present danger in these cramped settlements. With homes built of flimsy wood, paper, and straw, an errant spark or tipped-over candle could quickly engulf a whole village in flames. The great city of Edo, which would later become Tokyo, burned to the ground multiple times over the centuries, leaving tens of thousands homeless in the ashes. Even if they were fortunate enough to escape calamities of weather, pestilence, and fire, the peasants still faced the depredations of their social betters. Samurai were notorious for their casual cruelty to those beneath them, viewing the peasantry as little more than human cattle to be used and abused at will. Tales abounded of villagers being forced to kneel in the mud for hours or even days as punishment for minor transgressions, of farmers being beaten senseless for perceived disrespect, and of women being violated by bored samurai without consequence. The constant threat of violence was a fact of life for the peasantry, as rivalries between daimyo frequently erupted into open warfare across the countryside. When armies clashed, it was the villagers who suffered the most. Their homes and fields became battlegrounds for the armored samurai on horseback, with crops trampled, livestock slaughtered, and whole villages set ablaze as the warring factions laid waste to each other's domains. During these periods of unrest, thievery and brigandry were rampant as desperate peasants resorted to raiding and plundering to survive. Bands of ronin, masterless samurai dispossessed by the chaos, roamed the land, extorting food and valuables from the cowed populace. Even in times of relative peace, highwaymen lurked in the mountain passes and forests, preying on travelers and merchant caravans. With the samurai busy fighting each other, there was often little protection for the common folk. Despite enduring miseries and injustices, the peasants had virtually no recourse or path to a better life. The feudal hierarchy was rigid and unforgiving, with each person's role and rank ordained from birth. A peasant could not aspire to become a samurai, no matter his talents or ambitions. Even wealth offered no escape, as the rich merchant class, despite their money, still ranked beneath the poorest samurai in the social order. This inflexible caste system bred a deep sense of fatalism and resignation among the peasantry. They knew their lot was to endure, bear their hardships with stoic acceptance, and find what small comforts they could in family, community, and faith. Buddhism, with its emphasis on the impermanence of worldly things and the release from suffering through enlightenment, held particular appeal for the downtrodden masses. However, not all accepted their fate quietly. Pushed beyond endurance, peasants sometimes rose up in desperate, doomed rebellions against their overlords. These uprisings were usually local affairs, sparked by some especially egregious abuse or hardship, and quickly crushed by the superior arms and organization of the samurai. One of the largest and most famous peasant revolts was the Shimabara Rebellion of 1637–38. An estimated 27,000 Christian peasants on the Shimabara Peninsula, chafing under the brutal persecution of their faith, banded together to overthrow their daimyo and establish a kind of peasant utopia. The rebellion began with the peasants seizing several fortified castles, a stunning feat that testified to their zeal and their numbers. The Tokugawa shogunate, which had banned Christianity as a subversive foreign influence, dispatched a massive army to suppress the uprising. Despite being armed only with farming tools, the peasants held out against the siege for months before being overwhelmed. Ultimately, the rebel stronghold was stormed, resulting in the massacre of approximately 37,000 insurgents and sympathizers, including men, women, and children. This tragic event served as a poignant reminder of the significant power disparity between rulers and the ruled in feudal Japan. The Shimabara Rebellion would be the last major armed resistance by the peasantry, a futile act of defiance against a system that offered them no genuine hope or justice. In the subsequent centuries, Japan gradually transitioned from feudalism to a more centralized modern state. However, this transformation was gradual and uneven, with the rural peasantry often being the last to experience tangible improvements in their circumstances. Even as cities like Edo and Osaka flourished and prospered, life in the villages remained mired in poverty and toil for generations. It wasn't until the Meiji Restoration of 1868, which abolished the shogunate and restored the emperor to power, that the feudal system was finally dismantled, paving the way for a new, more egalitarian social order. Land reforms, industrialization, and the expansion of public education gradually lifted the peasantry out of the depths of poverty, although rural poverty persisted well into the 20th century. Reflecting on the present day, it becomes difficult to comprehend the immense human suffering endured during Japan's extended feudal era. For centuries, the majority of the population endured a bleak existence characterized by grinding poverty, ceaseless drudgery, and the constant threat of famine, disease, and violence. It was a time when an individual's life was predetermined from birth, their fate dictated by the accident of their social class. Yet it was also an era that gave rise to cultural traditions that would shape Japanese identity for generations. The samurai code of Bushido, the way of tea, and the austerities of Zen were just a few of the enduring legacies of this time. Despite the strife and cruelty that characterized it, this era also witnessed remarkable art, poetry, and spiritual yearning. Perhaps most importantly, it was a time of endurance. The Japanese people, through sheer tenacity and resilience, weathered the long centuries of hardship to lay the foundations of the modern nation we know today. As we reflect on this history from the comfort and security of our own age, it serves as a humbling reminder of the progress we've made and the struggles of those who came before us. It stands as a testament to the indomitable spirit of the human race, which has somehow managed to endure and even thrive through the darkest of times. And it challenges us to use our own relative good fortune to build a world of greater justice, compassion, and opportunity for all. With that quiet reflection, we conclude our journey through the brutal realities of life in feudal Japan. I hope this exploration of history has deepened your understanding of the past, even as it gently lulled you into the embrace of sleep. If you enjoyed drifting off to the sound of these tales, please like this video and subscribe to the channel for more soothing bedtime stories steeped in the fascinating annals of human civilization. Thank you for joining me on this voyage through the centuries, and may your dreams be filled with the wonders of ages past. Good night. Life under the strictly regimented feudal system was a constant struggle for survival, particularly for the lower classes, who constituted the vast majority. Not only were they perpetually on the brink of starvation, but they also faced a justice system that was swift and harsh in meting out punishments. Even minor crimes could result in severe penalties. Consider the story of a poor farmer named Haruku. In 1720, a series of poor harvests had left him and his family desperate and hungry. One morning, Haruoi was caught stealing a bag of rice from his daimyo's storehouse. He was swiftly arrested and brought before the local magistrate. There was no formal trial, instead a swift summary of his obvious guilt was delivered. The sentence for stealing from his lord was severe. Herky would be crucified. Crucifixion was a common form of execution in feudal Japan, often reserved for serious crimes against the state or superiors. The condemned would be tied or nailed to a cross and left to die a slow, agonizing death from exposure and asphyxiation, serving as a grim public warning to others. Herukchi spent his final hours tied to a rough wooden cross on the outskirts of his village. As he hung there in pain, slowly dying, he became a powerful reminder of the harsh consequences of violating social order. No matter how desperate one's circumstances, his wife and children would now be destitute, likely forced into servitude to avoid the same fate. This was the relentless harshness of feudal justice. Swift, brutal, and merciless, it aimed to keep the masses cowed and obedient through fear. There was no consideration for individual circumstances or mercy for the unfortunate. The system existed solely to preserve the rigid hierarchy, not to deliver true justice. Even those not facing the executioner's blade or the crucifixion stake were constantly threatened by draconian punishment. A samurai who failed in his duties, a peasant who fell behind on taxes, or a woman who displeased her husband could all face physical punishment, imprisonment, exile, or worse under feudal laws. The result was a society of stifling conformity, where even minor deviations from the norm could spell doom. This atmosphere of harshness and fear permeated even the arts of the time. The renowned haiku poet Matsu Basho, who lived from 1644 to 1694, often reflected on the transient nature of life and the ever-present specter of death in feudal Japan. One of his most renowned works, Summer Grasses, All That Remains of Warriors' Dreams, succinctly encapsulates the melancholic reality of his era. Basho poignantly conveys the ephemeral nature of even the mightiest samurai, their glories fleeting and forgotten in death. This poem serves as a poignant reminder of the relentless brutality of the age, where death loomed ever-present and life was often harsh, painful, and brief. As the Tokugawa period progressed, the rigidity and oppression of the feudal system began to strain under its own weight. The ruling shogunate struggled to maintain centralized control over the fracturing domains. Samurai found it increasingly difficult to justify their privileged status in an era of prolonged peace. Merchants resented the restrictions imposed upon them. Even as their wealth and influence grew, peasants, driven to the brink of exhaustion by famines and excessive taxation, launched several significant rebellions. The old order was gradually disintegrating, but it would require a seismic shock from the outside world to finally bring it down. That shock arrived in 1853, when American Commodore Matthew Perry's fleet of modern warships steamed into Edo Bay, forcing an end to Japan's centuries of self-imposed isolation. This abrupt confrontation with the industrial West triggered a crisis and a series of internal conflicts that ultimately led to the fall of the shogunate in 1868 and the emergence of a modernizing Japanese state. The feudal era of Japan was drawing to a close after centuries of entrenched brutality. The new Meiji era would usher in wrenching changes and upheaval as the nation embarked on a race to catch up with the world. However, it would also pave the way for new ideas, technologies, and opportunities that had been stifled under the stagnant and oppressive rule of the shoguns and daimyo. A rigid and often ruthless social order was gradually, fitfully, and painfully giving way to a more dynamic modern society. Reflecting on Japan's long feudal centuries, it's challenging to comprehend the immense suffering and loss endured. The peasants faced abject misery. Women were subjected to stifling restrictions. The justice system was cruel, and the constant threat of famine and warfare made life unbearably harsh for the majority. Despite these brutal conditions, The Japanese people managed to create hauntingly beautiful art, poetry imbued with profound human emotion, and a rich culture that endures to this day. Perhaps there's a peculiar comfort in the realization that our own daily struggles and anxieties, no matter how daunting, are transient in the grand tapestry of history. Even the formidable shoguns and samurai warlords, who once wielded the power of life and death over millions, are now long gone and largely forgotten, no more permanent than the fleeting summer grass. Yet their stories endure, and there's value in learning about and remembering them. By understanding the past, we gain a deeper grasp of the present and acquire wisdom for the future. We can appreciate the progress made in justice, equality, and peace, even as we confront the challenges we still face. As we conclude this chapter on the dark annals of feudal Japan, take a moment to reflect on the resilience of the human spirit across centuries. Pay respect to the nameless millions who endured, struggled, and perished in those harsh times, and appreciate the small daily blessings of our modern lives. From a soft bed to sleep in, and a safe home to wake up in, to the basic dignities and freedoms so many feudal Japanese were denied. These are the things we often take for granted. If you enjoyed this tour through the often tragic yet always captivating history of feudal Japan, consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more in-depth explorations of the rich, strange, and surprising tapestry of the human past. We'll continue to bring you immersive journeys through the ages, one story at a time. Until next time, thank you for watching and sweet dreams. As we've observed, life for the average person in feudal Japan was characterized by grueling labor, rigid social roles, and constant vulnerability to the whims of the powerful. The fictional yet representative stories we've explored vividly depict the quiet desperation and intense hardship that permeated feudal society. While peasant families, like the one we encountered earlier, labored tirelessly just to survive, even relatively privileged women of the samurai class lived stifling and subservient lives. Matsu Shimara's tale illustrates the limited autonomy and fulfillment available to women, regardless of their rank. Expected to master refined arts and graces, but little else, a proper lady's world rarely extended beyond the confines of the family home. Simultaneously, samurai men were indoctrinated from birth in the brutal code of Bushido, which demanded unwavering loyalty and a readiness to die at any moment. Seppuku, or ritual suicide by disembowelment, loomed as a constant threat should a warrior fail, transgress, or fall out of favor. The gruesome fate of the disgraced samurai lieutenant we heard about vividly demonstrated the extreme measures required to maintain honor in this martial culture. In many ways, the conformist values of Neo-Confucianism acted as an invisible prison, confining individuals to prescribed identities and stifling their individuality. For those at the very bottom of the hierarchy, like the ETA outcast and his family, it resulted in a crushing loneliness and limited existence, forever separated from mainstream society. Even the love between his sister and her peasant paramour was harshly forbidden, as human feelings took a back seat to unyielding social mores. While the growing merchant class gradually gained economic influence, it still faced a formidable social status ceiling. Families like the Tanakas invested countless hours in their businesses, paying exorbitant taxes and bribes, yet they were still considered low class and had to conceal their illegal Christian faith to avoid brutal persecution. This highlights the severe limitations on freedom of conscience. Similarly, entertainers like Hana the geisha lived in gilded cages, dedicating their lives to the refined arts and pleasing men, but their behavior and appearance were strictly regulated. Violating these codes resulted in physical punishment and confinement, leading many to despair and self-destructive habits. The harsh justice system, characterized by torture, corporal punishment, and a lack of due process, maintained order through terror and example-making. The tragic fate of the petty thief, broken by repeated floggings and executed for his desperation, exemplifies the inhumanity of a legal code that prioritized cruelty over mercy and rehabilitation. Looming over it all was the pervasive poverty that left most of the population destitute and dependent on their feudal masters. While occasional peasant uprisings like the one we heard about occasionally disrupted the status quo, they were always brutally suppressed in the end, with participants tortured and killed as warnings to others. In conclusion, feudal Japanese society was, in many ways, a beautiful and artistically vibrant one, responsible for exquisite material culture and enduring artistic traditions. However, it was also an extremely strict and hierarchical world, where the majority labored in misery to support a small elite in relative comfort at the top. The enduring legacy of this system is one of incalculable human suffering caused by its institutionalized oppression and entrenched inequality. The plight of the commoners, outcasts, and peasants we've encountered here was sadly all too common, their stories of quiet anguish now lost to time. While later chapters of Japanese history would hopefully chart a freer and more equitable course, we are left to reflect on the darkness endured by so many during the feudal centuries. Life may have often felt hopeless for those on the bottom rungs of this rigid system. However, in a sense, their sacrifices paved the way for a better future. By living through and bearing witness to such a harsh and uncompromising world, they have gifted us valuable lessons about the human costs of unchecked power and inflexible social hierarchy. With this somber reflection, we conclude our exploration of this tumultuous historical chapter. I hope this look into feudal Japan's often brutal realities has been both illuminating and thought-provoking, even as it lulls you into restful slumber. If you've enjoyed this journey through Japan's feudal past, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more immersive bedtime tales from history. As always, may your dreams be sweeter than the times you've just vicariously lived through. With that, I wish you a tranquil night and a peaceful sleep. Until next time, good night. After centuries of strict codes, rigid hierarchy, and institutionalized inequality, the feudal system that had long held Japan in its iron grip finally began to crack and fracture in the 19th century. The seeds of its demise had been planted long before in the hearts of those who toiled under its yoke, dreaming of a better life. The peasants who had long been the backbone of the nation, powering the economy with their back-breaking labor while reaping few rewards, grew increasingly resentful of the societal bonds that held them down. Although revolts like the one brutally suppressed in the 1780s had been quickly quelled, the spirit of discontent could not be easily quelled. It simmered beneath the surface, biding its time. The samurai class faced an existential threat as the centuries wore on. These formidable warriors, whose very identity was intertwined with their military prowess and code of honor, found their way of life becoming obsolete in an era of increasing peace and stability. Many samurai faced hardships, becoming masterless ronin as the demand for their martial skills diminished. The very power structure that had once elevated them now left them adrift. Even the daimyo, the great lords who governed feudal domains, were not immune to the winds of change. Weakened by centuries of infighting, intrigue, and excessive taxation of their subjects, many found their power and influence waning. The political and economic landscape was shifting beneath their feet. Despite their efforts to cling to the old ways, the tide of history could not be held back forever. However, perhaps the most significant catalyst for change came from beyond Japan's shores. For centuries, the nation had meticulously isolated itself from the outside world, maintaining limited contact through a few strictly controlled ports. This policy of sakoku, or closed country, allowed Japan to develop its unique culture and society in relative seclusion. But by the mid-9th century, the outside world could no longer be ignored. The arrival of Commodore Matthew Perry and his fleet of American ships in 1853 sent shockwaves through Japanese society. Perry's demand that Japan open its ports to foreign trade, backed by the threat of his powerful cannons, made it abundantly clear that the days of isolation were over. Japan found itself abruptly thrust onto the global stage, forced to confront a rapidly modernizing world. The years that followed witnessed a remarkable transformation as the old feudal order crumbled away, giving way to the emergence of a new modern nation. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked the formal end of the shogunate and the restoration of the emperor to nominal supreme power. However, more importantly, it signaled a profound shift in Japanese society as the nation embarked on a journey of modernization and sought to catch up to the Western powers. The samurai class, once a symbol of honor and privilege, was officially abolished, and their status and privileges were revoked. Many former warriors found it challenging to adapt to this new reality. Their swords were replaced by pens as they took on roles as bureaucrats and administrators in the newly formed government. Others embraced new professions, becoming teachers, doctors, or businessmen. While the transition was difficult for many, it reflected the changing times. The lives of ordinary people also underwent profound transformations. The rigid social hierarchy that had once maintained order began to crumble as new ideas about individual rights and freedoms gained traction. Education became more accessible, leading to increased social mobility. Peasants, no longer bound to the land, flocked to the cities in search of new opportunities. However, change was not an easy or conflict-free process. The rapid pace of modernization and the influx of foreign influence sparked backlash from some quarters, as conservatives sought to preserve traditional ways of life. The early years of the Meiji era witnessed numerous rebellions and uprisings as different factions vied for power and influence in the new order. Despite these challenges, Japan continued to push forward, determined to forge a new path. As the 19th century drew to a close, the nation that had once been governed by a rigid feudal system had transformed into a modern industrial power. This remarkable feat was achieved through the efforts and sacrifices of countless individuals, from the humble peasant to the most powerful lord. However, even as Japan celebrated its newfound status as a major global player, the scars of the feudal era lingered. The legacy of centuries of brutal oppression and inequality could not be erased overnight, and the nation would continue to grapple with the ghosts of its past as it embarked on its journey into the future. For the common people who had endured immense hardship and suffering under the feudal system, the promise of a brighter future was a beacon of hope. They had experienced the depths of despair, the gnawing hunger of famine, the terror of warfare, and the crushing weight of servitude. They had witnessed their loved ones brutalized and broken, their hopes and dreams shattered by the relentless grip of feudal oppression. Yet through it all, they persevered, clinging to the unwavering belief that a better life was attainable. And now, at last, it appeared that their long nightmare was finally coming to an end. The road ahead would undoubtedly be challenging, with numerous obstacles and setbacks to overcome. However, for the first time in centuries, the people of Japan could dare to dream of a future not dictated by the whims of birth or the privileges of their betters. As we reflect on this pivotal moment in Japanese history, it is impossible not to be struck by the incredible resilience and determination of the human spirit. Through centuries of darkness and despair, the people of Japan had endured, their hearts beating out a steadfast rhythm of hope and defiance. And when the moment arrived to seize their destiny, they did so with a fierce and unwavering resolve. This lesson resonates through the ages, a reminder that even in the face of the most daunting challenges, the human will to survive and thrive is an indomitable force. It serves as a testament to the enduring power of the dreams and aspirations that reside within us all, regardless of our humble origins or the formidable obstacles that lie ahead. Let us remember the struggles and sacrifices of those who came before, the countless lives spent in the arduous and bitter struggle for freedom and dignity, and let us honor their memory by continually striving to build a world where every individual, regardless of their station or circumstances, has the opportunity to live a life of purpose and meaning. As we conclude our journey through the tumultuous world of feudal Japan, I invite you to pause and reflect on the shared experiences we've encountered. We've witnessed tales of suffering and sorrow, of courage and resilience, of hope and transformation. These stories define our humanity and unite us across centuries. As you drift off to sleep, perhaps you'll dream of a different era, a world where oppression has been vanquished and the human spirit soars freely. A world where every individual has the opportunity to craft their own narrative and shape their destiny. A world where the brutality of the past has given way to the promise of a brighter tomorrow. May your dreams be filled with hope and wonder, and may you awaken to a world where history's lessons have been learned and a better future beckons. Thank you for joining me on this exploration of Japan's feudal era. If these tales of history and humanity captivated you as much as I have, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's embark on more captivating adventures through the intriguing twists and turns of our shared past. Until then, I wish you a restful sleep and a bright tomorrow. Good night. As we've observed, life for the common people in feudal Japan was characterized by relentless hardship, oppression, and a rigid social hierarchy that offered little prospect of a better future. The majority labored in grinding poverty, perpetually at the mercy of the whims of their local lords and samurai. Even those slightly elevated in the social hierarchy, such as skilled artisans and merchants, faced significant challenges. The Tanaka family, whom we encountered earlier, operated a modest kimono shop in the bustling capital of Edo. While their business provided a somewhat more comfortable existence compared to the peasants in the fields, they still encountered numerous daily struggles and restrictions. Long work hours were an inescapable reality for the Tanaka family. From the break of dawn until the wee hours of the night, the entire family was engrossed in the intricate process of crafting kimonos. Their shop was their entire world, and they rarely had a moment of respite. On top of their relentless labor, the family faced an onerous tax burden that drained their modest profits. The local daimyo demanded his cut, as did various officials and inspectors who could make life difficult if not adequately compensated. Bribes and kickbacks were simply part of the business. However, what truly kept the Tanakas up at night was the fear of their secret Christian faith being discovered. Christianity had been outlawed for over a century under the brutal suppression of the Tokugawa shogunate, forcing its adherents underground. Discovery meant arrest, torture, and even execution. Consequently, the family meticulously concealed their beliefs, refraining from even keeping Christian symbols or texts in their house to avoid detection. They prayed in silence and attended covert meetings with other believers under the guise of social calls. It was a heavy emotional burden, constantly on guard and never feeling truly free to be themselves. This was one of the great cruelties of the feudal system, where even the human spirit and freedom of conscience were not spared the weight of oppression. The Tanaka's story illustrates how even those who achieved a measure of economic security could not escape the authoritarian social order that demanded strict obedience and conformity. This is evident in the experience of Hana, a young geisha who found herself struggling under the restrictive codes that governed her every move. As an entertainer, Hana's role was to be pleasing and alluring to her male clients, but never to engage in actual romance or intimacy. When she inadvertently returned a client's amorous advances, she was severely beaten as punishment. Even Hana's choice of dress was not her own. The vivid colors and luxurious fabrics of a geisha's kimono were all part of the illusion she was meant to create. However, certain shades were forbidden to her, reserved only for her higher-ranking clientele. When Hana dared to wear a purple kimono that caught her fancy, she was placed under house arrest for her transgression. To cope with the crushing pressure and lack of agency, Hana drowned her sorrows in sake. But even this small act of rebellion had to be carefully concealed. A geisha was supposed to be poised and in control at all times, not a slave to drink and vice. So, Hana suffered her private misery in silence. The strict moral codes of the day made life a joyless trial for many. Public displays of affection were considered shameful, as were frivolous pastimes like dancing and theater. Laughter and leisure were luxuries reserved only for the samurai class, and even then they were indulged in moderation only. Austerity and restraint were the order of the day. These rigid standards were enforced through a swift and severe system of justice. The accused were presumed guilty until proven innocent, if given a chance to prove their innocence at all. Torture was commonly used to extract confessions, often leading to false admissions of guilt. Punishments were brutal and designed to inflict maximum suffering. Flogging with wooden paddles or iron rods was a common sentence for minor offenses, leaving the victim bloody and broken. Exile was another fate that awaited those who ran afoul of the law, cast out from their homes and families to fend for themselves in the wilderness. Perhaps the cruelest cut was reserved for those at the very bottom of the social order, the ETA class of outcasts, considered subhuman and unclean. The ETA were shunned by mainstream society and confined to their own squalid ghettos on the margins of towns. We met one ETA man who was born into this life of exclusion and stigma. Though his family worked essential jobs like butchering animals and tanning hides, they were still looked down upon and despised. They were forbidden from marrying outside their class or even wearing the same clothes as commoners. When his sister dared to fall in love with a peasant boy, Their innocent romance was met with swift and harsh condemnation. Such a breach of social order was intolerable, and they were both threatened with death if they didn't break off their relationship immediately. For the ETA and other outcasts, life was a constant reminder of their degraded status. They were not even afforded the basic dignity of being regarded as fully human. Their oppression was total and inescapable, enshrined in a rigid caste system that allowed for no social mobility. This was the overarching tragedy of feudal Japan. The vast majority of people were trapped in a suffocating hierarchy that determined their fate from birth to death. It was a system built on exploitation, cruelty, and the ruthless suppression of the human spirit. Even the arts and culture of the age reflected these bleak realities. The literary forms popular among the elites were often dark and cynical, dwelling on the fleeting nature of life and the inevitability of suffering. The great haiku masters wrote of existential despair, while the playwrights staged dramas filled with betrayal, vengeance, and death. There was little room for hope or optimism in this grim worldview. The people of feudal Japan endured lives of unrelenting hardship simply because they had no other choice. They were born into a system that demanded their submission and offered no path to a better future. But even in the darkest of times, the human spirit finds ways to resist. We see this in the small acts of defiance and self-assertion carried out by people like Hannah and the star-crossed lovers. They may have been crushed by the weight of their society, but they still found tiny ways to assert their humanity. In the grand tapestry of history, we recognize that change was inevitable. The feudal system, seemingly eternal, was destined for its demise. The seeds of its downfall were already being sown through economic shifts, social upheaval, and novel ways of thinking that would eventually dismantle the centuries-old order. However, these are tales for another day. For now, we present feudal Japan as it was, a harsh and unforgiving world where life was fleeting and often brutal. It serves as a sobering reminder of the cruelty humans can inflict upon one another when avarice and authoritarianism dominate society. Yet, it also stands as a testament to the indomitable human spirit. Despite such bleak conditions, people found ways to love, laugh, create art, and find meaning. This inextinguishable spark of hope propels us through even the darkest times. As this final chapter draws to a close, we invite you to pause and reflect on the incredible hardships and challenges faced by the people of feudal Japan daily. Their struggles may seem distant in time and place, but their experiences encapsulate universal truths about the human condition and the unyielding will to survive and resist oppression. If these stories and insights resonated with you, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel. There are countless more captivating journeys into the past waiting to be explored, and we would be honored to have you join us on this adventure. Until next time, this is your guide through the annals of history, wishing you a restful night's sleep filled with dreams of a brighter tomorrow. Although the feudal era was a time of great darkness, we find solace in knowing that the dawn of a new age was just beyond the horizon. Let us all strive in our own lives to learn from the past's mistakes, fight for justice and equality, and cherish the freedoms so cruelly denied to our ancestors. If we can achieve that, perhaps their suffering will not have been in vain, and we can begin to build a world where the light of human dignity shines for all. Good night, and thank you for joining us on this journey into the shadows of history. May your dreams be filled with the hopes of a better, more just world. As we've seen, the life of a peasant in feudal Japan was one of relentless hardship and toil. From sunrise to sunset, they labored in the fields, struggling to make ends meet at the mercy of their local lords. Even the slightest misstep or misfortune could spell disaster. Consider the story of young Jiro, a fictional yet all too representative farmer's son in the early 1700s. From the moment he could walk, Jiro was assigned to tasks such as feeding livestock, hauling water, and repairing tools. Playtime was a rare luxury. His childhood was spent in service to the unending demands of the rice paddies. As Jiro grew into adolescence, his responsibilities only increased. With his aging father struggling to keep up, more and more fell on Jiro's shoulders. Long days spent bent over in the muddy fields left him with an aching back and weathered hands that belied his youth. A quarter of the rice they grew was paid as tax to the daimyo, leaving precious little for their own sustenance. When Jiro was 16, his life took a dramatic turn. A minor dispute with a higher-ranking villager resulted in Jiro being knocked to the ground and his face pushed into the dirt. Enraged and humiliated, Jiro foolishly challenged the man to a fight. Unarmed combat between peasants was strictly forbidden. When word reached the magistrate, the punishment was swift and severe. Jiro was dragged before the village, stripped to the waist and tied to a post. In front of his family and neighbors, he was flogged 20 times with a wooden paddle. The crack of each blow echoed across the hill. By the end, Jiro was a bloody, broken mess. His skin was flayed from his back, and he hung limply in his bonds, barely conscious. For his insolence, Jiro was cast out of the village and exiled to wander as a beggar. If he returned, he would be executed on the spot. His tearful parents pleaded for mercy, but the law was unyielding. At 16, Jiro was now ruthless and alone, just another lost soul cut adrift in a callous feudal system. His pain and despair were like an unheard scream in the night. Jiro's tale may be fictional, but it echoes the reality faced by countless peasants of his time. In a rigidly hierarchical society with no social mobility, most were condemned to a life of poverty and servitude from birth. Stepped on by those above them, they had no recourse, no path to a better tomorrow. This sense of hopeless stagnation eroded the human spirit. Worn down by drudgery and deprivation, many sank into despair and nihilism. Suicide and infanticide rates were high, especially during times of famine. Heavy drinking and gambling offered fleeting escapes. Animosity toward the ruling classes sometimes boiled over into riots and uprisings, but these were always violently crushed. Some sought solace in religion, praying to Shinto spirits and Buddhist bodhisattvas for divine intercession. However, in a world where bad karma was believed to carry over from past lives, many saw their wretched state as an unalterable spiritual destiny. They were born into suffering because they deserved to suffer, as the dominant Neo-Confucian doctrine claimed. Also, opportunities for genuine joy and fulfillment were few. Marriages were arranged for practicality, not love. Festivities and holidays offered brief respite, but the specter of hunger and hardship always loomed. For farming families, a daughter was often seen as just another mouth to feed. Many were sold into servitude at a young age or trafficked into prostitution. This was the bleak reality hidden beneath the silk screens and cherry blossoms. The immense human suffering on which the elegant facade of feudal society was built. While samurai warlords engaged in their ceaseless power struggles, the peasantry bore the brunt of the bloodshed. Their cries were drowned out by the clamor of armor and swords. However, oppression could only endure for so long before the foundation began to crumble. By the mid-1800s, the feudal system was straining under its own weight. The samurai class had grown bloated and unruly, depleting the daimyo's coffers. Merchants were gaining economic influence, disrupting the traditional order. 2 centuries of enforced isolation had left Japan vulnerable and behind compared to industrializing Western powers. When external pressure finally compelled Japan's ports to open in 1853, the shockwaves reverberated throughout society. The influx of foreign ideas and technology challenged established beliefs. Calls for change grew louder even as the Tokugawa shogunates attempted to regain control. The ensuing turmoil heralded the beginning of the end for feudal rule. In 1868, imperial power was restored dramatically under Emperor Meiji, and Japan embarked on a rapid ascent into the modern age. The feudal caste system was officially abolished, although social inequalities would persist for generations. Rapid industrialization and militarization propelled Japan onto the global stage as an emerging colonial power. Even as the trappings of feudal life faded into history, its profound impact on the Japanese psyche endured. The Neo-Confucian ideals of filial piety, social harmony, and unquestioning loyalty to authority remained deeply ingrained, albeit less overt. The concept of knowing one's place continued to exert a powerful influence on the cultural imagination. In many ways, the story of feudal Japan is a testament to extraordinary resilience in the face of relentless adversity. Through centuries of war, famine, and oppression, Japan's people discovered ways to preserve their unique culture and identity. From the exquisite art of the floating world to the austere rituals of the tea ceremony, beauty and meaning were meticulously crafted from the darkest of circumstances. But we shouldn't romanticize this brutal chapter of history. The human cost was immeasurable, and the scars run deep. Feudal Japan was a society built on exploitation and suffering, where the powerful ruled with impunity and the weak endured their hardships. It serves as a solemn reminder of the cruelty we can inflict on one another. Let us remember the forgotten lives crushed beneath the wheel of feudal oppression, the lowly peasants, the shunned outcasts, the powerless women and children. May we bring their untold stories to light and honor their quiet strength and dignity in the face of a harsh and unforgiving world. As we drift off to sleep, let us be grateful for our progress, even as we acknowledge the lingering shadows of the past. The path to a truly just and equitable society is long and winding, and we still have a long way to go. However, by learning from history's harsh lessons, we can continue striving for a future where everyone has the opportunity to live with freedom and dignity. This concludes our journey through the dark annals of feudal Japan. If you found this exploration meaningful, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel for more in-depth dives into the hidden corners of history. I'll be here keeping the flame of remembrance alive, one story at a time. Until next time, thanks for watching and sweet dreams. While the artisans and merchants of feudal Japan may have found a brief respite from the backbreaking drudgery of the peasant class, their lives were still far from comfortable or secure. These urban dwellers, while privileged enough to pursue skilled trades or engage in commerce, were still subject to the rigid hierarchy that permeated every aspect of feudal society. Artisans like blacksmiths, weavers, potters, and woodworkers formed the backbone of the urban economy, crafting the essential goods that sustained the feudal machine. From the samurai's swords to the peasants' tools, the skilled hands of artisans were the driving force behind these creations. However, this talent did not translate into high status or a life of abundance. Artisans were still bound by the strict codes and regulations of the guild system, which essentially served as a tool for the ruling classes to maintain tight control over production and limit social mobility. Each artisan was required to belong to the appropriate guild for their trade, adhering to its rules on pricing, production methods, and the number of apprentices they could take on. This system was far from a free market, more akin to a cage of conformity that stifled any potential entrepreneurial spirit. Artisans couldn't simply strike out on their own or innovate beyond the guild's limitations. Everything had to be done by the book, suppressing any budding entrepreneurial aspirations. Moreover, the guilds closely monitored any foreign techniques or technologies that could disrupt the profitable status quo. In many ways, the guilds acted as yet another layer of control, allowing the samurai elites to maintain their stranglehold on power and wealth. While artisans didn't live in abject poverty like the peasantry, they also weren't living lavishly. A typical artisan worked grueling hours, often from sunrise to sunset, 6 or even 7 days a week. The entire family would contribute to the trade, with children learning the craft from a young age. Apprenticeships could last a decade or more, with aspiring artisans essentially serving as cheap labor until they demonstrated their mastery. Even then, they were still subject to the suffocating rules and restrictions of the guild. It was a life of endless toil with little room for rest or leisure. Similarly, merchants occupied a precarious position within feudal Japan's social hierarchy. On the one hand, merchants' skills in buying, selling, and transporting goods were crucial for the smooth functioning of the economy. Over time, some merchants amassed substantial fortunes, rivaling even the wealthiest samurai in terms of sheer wealth. However, in the eyes of the Neo-Confucian worldview that dominated feudal Japan, merchants were still considered the lowest on the social hierarchy. According to this philosophy, merchants didn't actually produce anything of value. They merely moved goods and profited from the labor of others. In a society that highly valued duty, loyalty, and social status, merchants' self-interested dealings were seen as distasteful at best and immoral at worst. This left the merchant class in a state of social limbo. They could never aspire to the ranks of the samurai, regardless of their wealth. They were perpetually viewed as greedy and untrustworthy. On the other hand, the samurai elites were more than willing to engage in business with successful merchants, often relying on them for loans to fund their extravagant lifestyles or military campaigns. This created a peculiar dichotomy. Merchants were scorned as social inferiors, yet increasingly indispensable to the feudal economy's functioning. Some of the most prosperous merchant families even managed to leverage their economic influence into a degree of political power, albeit indirectly. They might marry their daughters to minor samurai to establish a tenuous connection to the upper class, or use their wealth to gain favor and protection from powerful lords. However, no amount of money could fully shield the merchants from the hardships and restrictions of feudal life. They too were subject to the rigid codes and regulations that governed every aspect of society. Sumptuary laws dictated the types of clothes they could wear, the food they could consume, and even the kind of houses they could reside in, all based on their officially designated social rank. And like the artisans, the merchants worked grueling hours, with the entire family contributing to keep the business afloat. The markets and streets of feudal Japanese cities buzzed with commercial activity from dawn till dusk, with merchants hawking their wares, striking deals, and frantically scrambling to gain an advantage. For many, this life was consumed by the relentless pursuit of profit, leaving little room for anything else. However, even amidst the merchants' hardships, there was always someone lower on the social ladder. While the merchants may have been the lowest rung of the feudal hierarchy, there was one group considered so defiled that they weren't even part of the latter at all: the ETA. The ETA were the outcasts of outcasts, the untouchables of feudal Japanese society. This wasn't simply a matter of poverty or low status. The ETA were considered inherently polluted, tainted by their association with death and animal slaughter. They were the tanners, butchers, executioners, gravediggers, and anyone whose profession involved taking life or handling dead bodies. In the Neo-Confucian worldview, this contact with death rendered the ET permanently unclean, almost subhuman. Consequently, they were forced to live in segregated hamlets on the outskirts of towns and villages, forbidden from mingling with the rest of society. When they did venture beyond their quarters, they had to wear distinctive clothing, a kind of badge of dishonor, to warn others of their untouchable status. The depths of discrimination against the ETA were truly staggering. They were barred from marrying anyone of a higher social class, and not many would even consider such a taboo union. They were forbidden from entering certain temples and shrines, lest their mere presence sully the sacred grounds. Even their shadows were considered polluting. An eater had to bow their head and hunker down when passing a commoner on the road, lest their tainted silhouette fall across the path. It's difficult to overstate just how crushing this stigma was. The ETA, trapped in a permanent underclass, faced an insurmountable barrier to upward mobility. They were the lowest rung of a society already deeply stratified. Despite their essential labor, their contributions were met with disdain and avoidance. From tanning animal hides to butchering meat and digging graves, their work was vital. Yet no one desired to associate with these hapless souls. Imagine the perpetual struggle of an ATA family, forever relegated to the fringes of society. Perhaps they operated a small tannery, scraping and curing animal hides into leather. The work was grueling, involving caustic chemicals that burned the skin and noxious fumes that seared the lungs. Despite the hardships, it provided a meager means of survival. The tannery was situated in the ETA quarter, a ramshackle hamlet of dilapidated huts on the village's outskirts. The air was thick with the stench of rotting carcasses and fermenting hides, a constant reminder of their existence. An old factory barrier stood as a warning to the rest of the villages, keeping them at bay. Here, the ETA toiled from dawn till dusk, their hands permanently stained with the muck of the slaughterhouse. Perhaps the tanner had a daughter, a bright and beautiful girl who yearned for a life beyond the confines of the Eta quarter. However, she understood that her status as an untouchable was an immutable curse, passed down through generations. She would likely marry another Eta, bear Eta children, and witness them struggle against the same merciless stigma that had always shackled her people. Yet, even in this bleakest of circumstances, the ETA clung to their dignity and humanity. They formed tight-knit communities, bound together by their shared hardships and their unwavering refusal to let the dominant society crush their spirit. In moments of quiet grace, amidst the relentless discrimination, they found solace in their own rituals and traditions. But make no mistake, life for the ET was a brutal and soul-crushing existence. They bore the harshest brunt of feudal Japan's rigid hierarchy, forever relegated to the shadows and squalor of society. Their suffering was immense and unrelenting, a testament to the human capacity for both cruelty and resilience. The social fabric of feudal Japan was intricately woven, with each thread in its designated place. From the gleaming heights of the imperial court to the squalid depths of the quarters, it was a tapestry of astonishing intricacy and shocking inequity. The accident of birth determined one's entire life course. The samurai ruled with an iron fist, while the peasants toiled in perpetual servitude. The artisans and merchants scraped by under suffocating regulation, and the eaters were ground into the very dirt beneath society's feet. Perhaps most tragic of all was the way this rigid hierarchy was justified and reinforced by the prevailing philosophies of the time. Neo-Confucianism, with its emphasis on social order and knowing one's place, provided a tidy cosmological framework for keeping everyone in their designated slot. Buddhism, while ostensibly offering a path to enlightenment for all, often reinforced the notion of karmic destiny. If you were born a peasant or an ET, it must be because of your actions in a past life. Even the native Shinto religion, with its countless gods and spirits, was co-opted by the ruling classes to bolster their authority. The emperor was said to be descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu herself, a divine lineage that granted him unquestionable legitimacy. The samurai too claimed a sacred mandate, with their rigidly enforced code of Bushido rooted in quasi-religious notions of honor, loyalty, and noble self-sacrifice. Against this formidable backdrop of religious and philosophical justification, it's no wonder that feudal Japan's social hierarchy remained so entrenched for so long. When every aspect of the cosmos seemed to dictate the existing order, and even the gods themselves appeared to condone the suffering of the oppressed, it required an almost superhuman act of will to envision anything different. Despite the relentless brutality of the era, glimmers of hope managed to pierce the gloom. There were always those who yearned for something more, who dared to dream of a world beyond the suffocating confines of the feudal system. Sometimes these dreamers were crushed and silenced, crushed under the heel of the status quo. However, against all odds, they managed to ignite a spark of change. Perhaps it was a samurai who questioned the rigid code of Bushido, who saw the humanity in even the lowest peasant or the despised eat. Or a merchant who used his wealth to support the arts and learning, creating spaces for free thought and creativity amidst the stifling conformity of the age. Or a peasant who, through sheer force of will and ingenuity, managed to rise above his assigned station to carve out a small slice of autonomy in a world that would grant him none. These acts of defiance and self-assertion, however small or fleeting, were the seeds of change. They held within them the promise of a different way, a hint of the transformation that was to come. For feudal Japan, as mighty and seemingly unyielding as it appeared, was not destined to last forever. No social order, however deeply entrenched, can endure forever in the face of the indomitable human spirit. But change, when it arrived, would not be easy. The path from feudal rigidity to modern dynamism was a long and bloody one, paved with the bones of countless martyrs and revolutionaries. It would take the wrenching upheaval of the Meiji Restoration, the shattering of the samurai class, and a complete overhaul of the political and economic order to drag Japan kicking and screaming into the modern age. And even then, the legacy of those feudal centuries would linger long in the national psyche. The values of conformity, the understanding of one's place, and the sublimation of the individual to the group would prove stubborn weeds with deep roots in the cultural soil. Even as Japan transformed itself on the surface, becoming an industrial and military powerhouse on the world stage, those ancient hierarchies still lurked in the shadows, subtly shaping society. But that's a tale for another time. For now, let's take a final lingering look back at the world of feudal Japan in all its harrowing brutality, its rigid elegance, and its aching, stifled humanity. It was a world of exquisite beauty and unspeakable cruelty, of soaring triumphs and crushing despair. A world where the accident of birth could seal one's fate as surely as the sword, where life was both cheap and infinitely precious. As we contemplate this lost world, this strange and distant mirror of our own, perhaps we can find some glimmer of recognition. For the human experience, in all its sorrow and glory, its suffering and transcendence, is never wholly foreign to us, no matter how far removed in time and space. The ghosts of feudal Japan, long dead and gone to dust, still whisper to us across the ages, their stories yearning to be heard. So let's listen and remember. Let's honor the lives that were crushed by the iniquities of the age, the dreams that were crushed under the weight of oppressive hierarchy. And let's learn from their hard-won victories, their stubborn resilience, and their unquenchable spark of hope in the face of overwhelming despair. For in the end, the lesson of feudal Japan is not just one of unrelenting darkness, but also of the indomitable human spirit that can never be wholly extinguished. It's a reminder that even in the most suffocating of circumstances, the yearning for freedom, for dignity, and for a better world can never be entirely suppressed, and that ultimately is the most enduring legacy of this strange and tragic era. A testament to the indomitable human spirit and its unwavering capacity for hope. Our journey through the dark annals of feudal Japan draws to a close. It has been a harrowing voyage, filled with tales of brutality, oppression, and unimaginable suffering. Yet amidst the darkness, glimmers of light have shone through courage, compassion, and the unyielding spark of human dignity. As we bid farewell to this chapter of history, let us carry with us a renewed appreciation for the blessings of our own time and a deepened empathy for those who came before us. If these tales of a bygone era have offered a strange sense of solace in their distant tragedy, perhaps you'll find comfort in drifting off to sleep with the weight of history as your lullaby. After all, there is a profound peace to be found in contemplating the vast expanse of human experience, both in its sorrow and splendor. It puts our own trials and triumphs into perspective and reminds us of the fleeting nature of all earthly things. So, rest now and let the echoes of old Japan carry you off to slumber. If you enjoyed this exploration into the darker corners of history, consider subscribing to this channel. There are always more untold tales waiting to be unraveled. But for now, good night, and may your dreams be free from the haunting memories of feudal Japan. They have lingered long enough in the shadows of memory. Let us grant them at last the peace of a quiet repose. As we've witnessed, life for the vast majority in feudal Japan was defined by grueling labor, grinding poverty, and a rigid social order that offered little hope of a better future. The relentless struggle to survive consumed nearly every waking hour, with each day merging into the next in an endless cycle of toil and deprivation. For the peasants, who constituted the majority of the population, existence was particularly bleak. They were essentially bound to the land they worked and subject to the capricious whims of their local lords. Rising before dawn, peasants labored tirelessly in the fields until dusk, extracting the meager sustenance they could from the earth. However, their hard-earned fruits of labor were never truly their own. A crushing tax burden ensured that the lion's share of any harvest went to fill the coffers of the local daimyo and samurai class. Payments were due in rice and other crops, leaving peasant families with barely enough to survive on. In lean years, when harvests were poor, many faced the grim prospect of starvation. Even in good times, most lived on the brink of subsistence, forever one failed crop away from destitution. This precarious existence was further compounded by the fact that peasants enjoyed very little in the way of rights or legal protections. The strict codes that governed feudal society placed them firmly at the bottom of the hierarchy, their lives considered expendable by those above them. Samurai, who served as the enforcers of this rigid order, could strike down a peasant with impunity for any perceived slight or breach of etiquette. This vicious cycle of poverty made escape nearly impossible. Denied education and opportunities for advancement, peasants were locked into their subservient status from birth. The scant surplus their labor generated was quickly siphoned off by rents and taxes, leaving no path to accumulate even modest wealth or holdings. The weight of this system bore down across generations, each born into the same misery as the last. Desperate families might resort to selling children into servitude or prostitution when times grew lean, forever severing their most precious bonds for a few coins to ward off starvation. Even the relative security of a peasant village offered little refuge from the upheavals of the era. Rival warlords vying for supremacy frequently clashed in the provinces, their armies living off the land as they marched. For villagers caught in their path, this could spell disaster, as homes were razed, food stores plundered, and loved ones cut down by uncaring blades. The story of the Sato family, humble rice farmers living in the shadow of Mount Fuji in the early 1600s, vividly portrays the precarious lives of the peasantry. For generations, the Satos had labored tirelessly on their small plot, striving to make ends meet. Goro, the aging patriarch, traced his lineage back countless generations, all enduring the relentless challenges of the unforgiving earth. As the scorching summer stretched on without a drop of rain, their rice paddies withered under the merciless sun. By harvest time, only stunted grains emerged from the cracked earth, a mere fraction of the usual harvest. With heavy hearts, the family measured out their portion, setting aside the rest for the tax collector. What remained was barely enough to last the harsh winter, as hunger gnawed at their bellies during the cold months that followed. Goro and his wife Mako grew increasingly desperate. Their 2 young sons were listless and wasting away before their eyes. Mako implored Goro to withhold some rice from the tax payment. However, he understood that failing to pay in full could spell even greater disaster. Having witnessed neighbors dragged off and beaten severely for short payments, he knew the consequences. In the end, they made a desperate decision to survive. With no coins to buy food, the only valuable possession the family had left was their daughter Akiko's youth and beauty. One dark night, Mako bundled up the frightened 12-year-old and, choking back sobs, delivered her to the village brothel. The meager sum she received in return would be enough to buy a few more months of meager food. But the family would never be whole again. Akiko's fate was all too common for vulnerable peasant girls of that era, sold into servitude or brothel by desperate families. Their brief lives were marked by exploitation and abuse. Viewed as little more than cattle, they enjoyed no autonomy or legal protections. Beaten down and often gravely ill, few survived the harrowing conditions of that time. The trauma of Akiko's loss shattered the already strained Sato family. Months later, Goro's aged body finally succumbed to the weight of his years, collapsing in the very patties he had dedicated his life to. Mako would follow before the year ended, succumbing to the ravages of grief and starvation. Orphans, the 2 young boys were left to fend for themselves, their futures uncertain amidst the chaos of the times. While the Stowe's tale is fictional, it resonates with the real accounts of peasant hardship during that era. It highlights the bitter irony of the period, where those who labored the hardest received the least rewards, forever excluded from the comforts and security enjoyed by the ruling class. As we reflect on the immense suffering and injustice endured by the common people of feudal Japan, it's important to remember that their story is not entirely unique. Throughout history and across the globe, rigid hierarchies that concentrated power and wealth in the hands of a privileged few have often brought misery to the masses below. However, we can find solace in the fact that change, albeit gradual, did come to Japan. The feudal order that had endured for so long finally began to crumble in the 19th century, succumbing to its own contradictions and the relentless push of modernization. In the tumultuous decades that followed, Japan underwent a transformative journey, with the old ways crumbling before the unstoppable march of progress. The road ahead would not be easy, with new challenges and upheavals waiting in the wings of history. But it was a path forward, out of the stifling confines of the feudal past, and into a new era where the glimmer of a better life flickered on the horizon. As we conclude this chapter on the often brutal realities of feudal Japan, the hushed sounds of the night beckon you towards restful slumber. Let your mind drift off into the comforting embrace of sleep, the cares of the past fading like mist beneath the rising sun. And if you found this journey through history an intriguing companion on your nightly voyages, consider giving this video a gentle tap of the like button and a drowsy click of the subscribe link. Until next time, our paths will cross on the dusky roads of the past. I bid you the very sweetest of dreams. Good night.